Happy New Year, everyone. I am Shelley Rogers. I am a member of the web team here at Liberty Fund. I'd like to thank you for joining us for the first installment of From the Shelf with Curator Arnold Kling for the year 2025. Before we begin, I'd like to mention that we will open the floor for live questions approximately 45 minutes into the session. Please feel free to use the Q&A feature or the raise hand, and when appropriate, I will invite you to ask your question live. Now, without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Arnold Kling and our esteemed guests, Rachel Ferguson and Bryan Caplan. Arnold?
Okay, thanks, Shelley. So I'll try to give very brief introductions to these guests, and you're welcome to add things. Rachel Ferguson is a philosophy professor and a head of a I'll have her. Can you name your
the Free Enterprise Center?
Okay, Free Enterprise Center at Concordia, Chicago, and the author of Black Liberation Through the Market. Welcome her. And Bryan Caplan is an economist associated primarily with George Mason University, and I think a fairly well-known public intellectual, author of a variety of books that many of which stray from economics, and we let you do that. Okay, the book we're discussing today is called Progressive Myths by Michale Huemer, and without casting too many aspersions at Rachel, I will say that Michale Huemer is an exceptional philosopher in that you can understand what he says. That it's sometimes when I read stuff or attempt to read stuff by philosophers, I feel like they owe it to their profession to be obscure and jargon filled. And that's coming from economics, which is often obscure and jargon filled, but I think philosophy often seems to have that topped. Okay, so the book is called Progressive Myths, and I'll just give a few things from the table of contents to give people a flavor of some of the things he's talking about as myths. He talks about racist police shootings as a myth, the gender pay gap as a myth, campus rape culture as a myth, generational wealth, that is sort of, people hoarding wealth generation to generation as a myth, and so on. We're discussing this, ironically, a couple days into the Trump administration. And so a question I would want to ask our guests is, who should read this book and why? And does your answer to that question change as a result of the new political situation? So, Rachel, can you take that one first? Who should read this book and why?
Well, I will say that the book is extremely even-handed, and for that reason, I would love for everyone to read it, only because we are in such a polarized moment, and that means that people can be coming to a lot of conclusions in a reactionary way. Right. So I'm bouncing off of the other side, right? Whatever they're doing, I'm doing the opposite. And Huemer is very careful to look very closely at each individual case and look at the data and the facts. And he's therefore, yes, he's giving the progressives a spanking. And so you want progressives to read it. But actually, I think it's a really good example of mental discipline for conservatives as well. So there are many things, for instance, in the police shootings where he says, hey, here's the examples of ones that are, sort of popularly understood as racist murders, but there's really no reason to think that. They were probably justified police shootings. But then again, he does 3 examples of really egregious police shootings, of cases that we really should be upset about and concerned about. And so he's very balanced in that sense. And so in that way, I think it would be incredibly helpful just to get out of some of the bad mental habits we're forming on social media and places like that for everyone to read a book like this.
Bryan, what's your take?
Yeah, I would say that this book is very good for anyone that actually wants to objectively engage with some ideas. The title, I think most people would just assume, well, it's called Progressive Myths, so it's just going to be another dogmatic, totally ideological right-wing hatchet job, and it is not that. Um, I have often commented that Mike Huemer is the kind of person that you would read to learn how to think, if it's possible to teach someone how to think. There is a whole literature in psychology saying, yeah, there's very little sign that we can teach people how to think. But if that could be done, it would be accomplished by reading someone like this who decompartmentalizes each issue. It's not that everything is just a splinter off the giant gem of knowledge such that every single piece reflects everything else, but rather each issue gets a separate analysis, separate evidence. And just the whole way that he structures the book, where he says, look, I'm not going to try to answer any vague questions. Just like, what's better, capitalism or socialism? Like, it's too vague. I want to go and narrow it down to questions where we can look at specific bodies of factual evidence and then walk away and say right or wrong. And that's what he does. In terms of whether it's more or less important to read it now, I would say that it's hard to say. Like many people say, well, woke is dead anyway. So no one needs to read anymore. We all know that it's wrong. Yeah, I think that's pretty crazy. You might want to read it just to say what things that are changing are justified changes, what things that are changing are not justified changes. That would be a very reasonable approach. I think I would do it like that.
Okay. So what would you say were your sort of favorite chapters, or the chapters that made you think, wow, this was an argument that I hadn't come across before. It was really, kind of new to me. And then sort of what were the chapters where you said, okay, this isn't new, or maybe he didn't write in the most persuasive way. Why don't we just go back to taking turns? Rachel, you want to take that one first?
Sure. I would say, one of the points he makes in the book is that nobody can keep up with all the literature on all of the controversial, things that we are still expected to have an opinion on, right? We're reading it in the news and we're discussing it on Facebook and so forth. And so, as obviously someone who engages these issues as part of my job, I actually do keep up with most of the things that he discusses in each chapter. But there were some areas where I have often felt behind, like climate change. Climate change is one of those areas where, it's not really in my body of work. And I have a general sense of what the wisdom is, but it was really, really helpful to just walk through his reasoning of the data that we have, what we mean by scientific consensus, and so forth. So that was particularly helpful to me, where things that have to do with race and that's related to my book. So I tend to keep up with that. I will throw this out too, on the stereotype threat. Stereotype threat is, there's the famous Whistling Vivaldi by Claude Steele. And I actually read that book and was sort of amazed by it. I thought, wow, this seems to be fairly reliable psychological data and seems like a pretty believable.
So fill us in on what that book said.
Yeah, so the idea was that if you're a woman in math, say, or if you're a Black student in a school where most of the students are white, whatever it might be, you end up actually performing worse on things like exams because you feel the pressure of representing your whole group, right? And so the nervousness and anxiety that comes with that then affects your test scores. And the way that Claude Steele lays it out, I remember thinking, this data looks pretty good to me. I was just reading the book. I wasn't doing a deep dive. And I was actually interested in the fact that by the end of the book, he says something like, yeah, and the answer to this is to say, I have really high standards, but I know you can reach them. And I thought, well, that's not a very progressive answer. That seems like a conservative answer. So I ended up sort of buying the argument. And he does a really good job of showing, not that it doesn't exist at all. A stereotype threat is probably something, right? It's in there somewhere, but that it's not a huge determinant. when it comes to the differences in test scores in various areas. And so just slicing and dicing that data was helpful for me as well, since that was a book I was familiar with.
And anything that you left you a little unconvinced, or you felt like he wasn't making the best argument for?
You know, I would say I had little nitpicky things, so not necessarily the overarching point of a whole chapter. But I'll give you an example of a couple of little nitpicks that I wrote down in my notes. At one point, he's talking about the implicit bias testing, right? And so in order to, and I think he does a good job of really undermining the reliability of a lot of that implicit bias testing. It's just not a super helpful thing to do. And implicit bias training can sometimes cause more problems than it solves, right? So he does a good job, I think, on that. And I tend to agree with him. But at some points, he, you know, I didn't think he quite grasped the feminist argument, for instance. And so he says, well, look, you know, if you do these tests where you associate white or black with goodness or badness, and people press a button, and if they delay a little bit more when they press a button, it looks like they have an implicit bias. They don't want to associate goodness with blackness or something like that. And he says, well, look, just flip it and do men and women, right? If you associate men with goodness or with badness, right? Or women with, and of course, men come out worse, you know, men come out, you know, we delay more in associating them with goodness than we do with women. And he says, so see, you know, it doesn't make any sense because women are the oppressed ones, right? And in that particular argument, I thought, I'm not sure you understand the feminist view there, right? Because I'm not a feminist either, but I think I grasp what they're saying, which is that the bias in favor of men is not that we associate more goodness with men or that we don't have prejudice against men, but rather that we associate power with men, right? And so we look at the woman and we don't think of her as boss. That's different from thinking of her as good or bad, right? And so in a couple of places, I thought, I didn't find that particular way of coming at the argument super compelling, but he had enough other arguments to cover his point that I was still convinced in the end.
Bryan?
So since I have a policy of not following the news, I didn't know very much about his myths about individuals. And since he is an actual philosopher going over the cases with a philosopher's eye, I found that very good. So like the Kyle Rittenhouse case seemed like there were so many strong opinions on it. And he went through it with the philosophy of, well, what counts as self-defense? And does crossing state lines mean that you no longer have a right of self-defense? So these were some things that I thought were illuminating anyway. Let's see. The gender pay gap, I already know a lot about it, so it wasn't new to me, but that doesn't mean that a lot of other people don't need to hear about it. The stuff where I had only the vaguest sense was on the prevalence of false rape reports. So he went over some of the most prominent studies and how they have been very deeply misstated. I mean, and again, like what's really nice is that while he is going over empirical evidence, he's doing it with a philosopher's eye. So the question of, well, when someone says like only 2% of rape reports are false, it's like, well, how do you know? Are you like omniscient? Like, where do you get this information about what the true and the false ones are? And it's like, okay, well, the way we're doing it is, and then you find out, oh, so you're only counting things as false if the accuser recanted. All right, that doesn't seem like the same thing as the only way something could be false. So that seemed pretty misleading. I actually just did a podcast with Huemer himself 2 days ago. So I was giving him my preferred story on transgenderism, where it comes down to this: like, first of all, the standard definition, a woman is an adult human female. That's the actual literal definition. And then I said the idea of the expansive definition is just as we have honorary categories in other groups. You can get an honorary degree. Is it the same as a real college degree? No, but you can give it to someone to be nice. Right. And then, so similarly, like my story is like, are adoptive parents parents? Like, well, literally, no, of course not. Right. If your grandparents raise you, does that make your grandparents your parents? No, but we call adoptive parents parents to be nice. And so anyway, that was my story. And then he wasn't convinced by that. So I thought he should be convinced, but right. So anyway, but no fault of his.
What was his alternative?
So like he was talking about like, well, like, is it possible to have a mind of one gender while a body of another? And it's like, all right, and kind of, to me, that was getting at a level of too philosophical, right? Perhaps.
Can I jump in on that one,
Yeah,
Brad?
sure.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I thought so. The transgenderism issue is really difficult because I don't actually think the term transgender um, is slices and dices enough, right? You actually have several categories.
Yes.
So, and he talked about this. So he talked about sort of your traditional, like very young onset gender dysphoria. Then you've got rapid onset gender dysphoria, which is occurring in a lot of girls at puberty. And then you've got late onset gender dysphoria, which is occurring in middle-aged men who are attracted to themselves as women, which is called autogynephilia.
Yep. And then, of course, there's actual biological hermaphroditism, which
right, and then
almost nobody wants to talk about, which is totally real, right?
Right, and he deals with intersex as well. And so all of that to say, I thought it was interesting. Number one, that he just bothered, right, to sort of point out the different groups and the ways that we might think completely differently about an autogynephiliac as we would about someone who's, been uncomfortable with their body since they were 2 years old. But the other thing that he said, which I really want to look at myself, because I've never seen this, is that brain scans are different not in the adolescent or later onset, but in the early onset, you actually see some of the signals of a more feminine brain in a man or of a more masculine brain in a woman. And I wasn't aware of that, as that sort of a physical disorder that's giving rise to the gender dysphoria.
Yeah, I was talking about that with him as well. So I have this paper on the economics and philosophy of mental illness called The Economics of Sauce. And it's one where it's like, well, on what view of philosophy of mind would you not see a correlation between brain and behavior and feelings? I think all of them predict it. So I don't think it really says anything. If you found out that nuns had a different kind of brain, would that mean that being a nun is a disease or a disorder?
Yeah.
So it's like, no, okay, well, then what's going on is there's some background idea about, well, there's some things we're kind of really open to calling a disease and other things we're not going to call a disease. And then we will selectively go and do brain scans to go and support our case if convenient. So yeah, I think, so like I've got like a general objection to that, but
interesting.
Nothing particular here. So really, like probably like the really cool thing about the book is, like you were mentioning, that there's so many issues, nobody can actually keep up on all of them. But there is the question of how reliable is the media and elite opinion generally, and his answer is not very. So it's one where it does teach you to just distrust the media and to realize that they are just not a reliable body of experts in anything that is politicized. At least that's probably the best way of thinking about it. If it's politicized, that's where your default should be probably they are exaggerating or just lying, or they're just so biased they can't even see their own flaws. There's this great thought experiment that Huemer wrote. It's one of my very favorite in all philosophy. It's not in the book, but he just said, look, suppose there's a school where all they do all day is teach kids true bad things about Jews. So all they do all day, every day is, and then there's this time that Chaim Weizmann in the 1400s went and, and killed somebody's mule. And like, it just goes on and on all day. And then someone says, you're just teaching anti-Semitism. I'm like, no, every claim is fact checked. And you go through, it's like, all right, fine, every single story is true, but it's still horribly biased because you are selecting on, it has to be negative and about Jews, or else I'm not going to talk about it. So every other one of the 4 logical possible boxes gets ignored. And this, I say, is the real media bias. It's not so much that they are factually incorrect, is that they will almost only tell you things that are either very negative or very leftist. And that's pretty much what you can count on them to do.
But is this book then doing that in some sense? It's sort of listing all the things, but let's say that progressives have 1,000 kind of opinions about events, and 15 of them end up in this book, and 985 of them are actually just fine. Is that concerning?
That would be a very reasonable problem, except that he's talking about the main things they talk about. So I don't think that that's going to work. He actually missed a couple things that I thought that he would do. So I did a thing on the missing myths. He doesn't have anything on the race pay gap, for example. And, for that, he just said he just, had finite time, finite energy. So, but anyway, so he is not going and lemon picking the things where they happen to be worst. He's going over the main things they've been talking about for the last 15 years. So I don't think we got that problem really.
Yeah, it's definitely a greatest hits of,
Mhm.
of progressives.
Yeah. I mean, especially like on the individuals where, like you were saying, he goes over a few cases where the normal story is correct.
Now, can I bring up another sort of devil's advocate argument, Arnold?
Sure.
This is along the lines of what you're saying, but a little bit of a different angle. Could you play devil's advocate? At the opening of the book, he says, I really am more worried about progressives than conservatives. You have some crazy claims being made on either side, but here's why, right? They control, they sort of have cultural hegemony, right? They've got the universities, they've got Hollywood, et cetera, the media. And
K-12,
so,
K-12 too.
Say it again.
K-12 too.
Right. Oh yeah.
Yes.
Colleges of ed. Oh my gosh. Yes.
Yeah.
And so you can buy his argument, but I have heard some people push back on that. So I've heard people say, it's true that the one place where conservatives still have a decent amount of power is in Congress itself. But should we be worried that the people that conservatives, I don't want to say true conservatives, but populists have in power are particularly crazy, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, or that some of the conspiracy theories are particularly dangerous, like the huge anti-vax movement that's gained such, momentum, or even just the habit of creating a conspiracy theory every time something big happens in the news, right? So this has become almost like a trope now. There's fires in Maui, the lasers, the government hit houses with lasers and avoided the Hollywood houses. It's like, what? So I don't know that I am compelled by that, but I wanted to throw it out there and get y'all's response. Could someone come back and say, I don't know, conservatives have some really dangerous myths too?
Well, I think again that gets to when I asked the question, in the context of 2 days into a Trump administration, is this as important a book, or are you as compelled? Now, one argument would be, well, if you're sort of a nonpartisan or somewhat sympathetic to the left person, maybe it's even more important to purge myths now, because maybe those myths have helped cost you an election. You've lost some credibility because maybe there are people who don't need to read this book to see the myths, or maybe it's more compelling because now there's this triumph of this sort of populist view, and these are people who will, who going back to your point that that point that both of you made, that people need to learn to think and think clearly, and just sort of so seeing how to debunk but be fair to the other side would be a good model to work on. But anyway, so
I mean, you say a lot of what I would think of as, look, there's a division of labor, and Michale Huemer is someone who specializes in talking to people who are reasonable and intelligent. He's not someone who's going to go and debunk weird conspiracy theories because the flaws are so glaring. And the way that he describes it is, look, many of these are views that I once held because they sounded plausible at first hearing. They didn't have the same kind of glaring absurdity of lizard men running something. So right. I think that's historians like, look, it's like Mike. I know Mike would not have any problem with someone else going and writing a book critiquing conspiracy theories, but I think he would say, look, that's not what I'm going to be good at, because I'm trying to go and talk to a higher level audience. You might say, well, the higher level, the lower level audience won't read the book about debunking conspiracy theories. Like, well, then you got a real problem, because like the only people that would read the book about it are people that wouldn't agree with it in the first place. You got to come up with something else. You got to do, I don't know, like a stand-up comedy against conspiracy theories. If you want to go and reach that broader audience, you got to come up with some other medium of talking about it.
I mean, maybe it's a good way to draw some of those people in, because these are things it's gonna be easy for them to accept, easier for them to accept. And so drawing them in with, okay, I'm going to show you how to debunk the gender wage gap. Okay, now you have a little bit more of a mental habit that you might apply to your own.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the story that you give this book to people who are anti-woke and you get credibility, and then you say, okay, so I've written this book, but you know what? I think vaccines are safe and effective.
Right.
Which again, you might hope, but don't get your hopes up, honestly. Right. I mean, it may very well be that it's like, there's this meme where there's this frowny face and it just says, you just said one of the things I agree with. You have to say all the things I agree with. And it's like, well, I'm not going to say all the things you agree with. You're kind of crazy.
Yeah, even in the book, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of the people I'm thinking of, the conservatives I'm thinking of, that wouldn't like the chapter on climate change. Because he's certainly not arguing about the existence of climate change, and he's open to the possibility that it's man-made, and just thinks that the data isn't exactly clear yet.
Yeah, I mean, hilariously, I know some people looked at the table of contents and said, I'm not going to read this book because he's a climate denier. It's like, look, maybe you should flip to the objectionable chapter and see what he really says.
Right.
Okay. By the way, Shelley, how are we doing are people starting to raise hands? Are we starting to see questions, or are they being patient?
They are being very patient. We don't have any questions yet. So if everybody would like to start thinking about some questions, maybe throw your hand up or put it in the Q&A. We can interrupt the conversation in about 10-15 minutes.
Okay. I still want to push, if I can, to have you guys discuss this kind of in the current context. So what would be, and this is a tough one, because what I want to ask is, how should progressives be reacting both to this book in this context? And I think that I'll preface that or amend that by noting that usually when people talk about, like how should progressives react or how should conservatives react, the answer is the way to win the next election is to follow my personal policy preferences. So let's hope we can stay away from that. But sort of what would you want a progressive to take away from reading this book? What would you want them to do differently, think differently, or whatever?
Well, I mean, the obvious one is just reject all these myths. There's the scene at the end of Godfather where he says, do you reject Satan? Yeah, I do. I do reject him. You're all his works. So it's like, just go through all the every myth and just say, do you reject it? Yes, I reject it. And it's like, well, can you still be a progressive after you reject them all? It's like, yeah, not really. You got to be something else after that. And then the question of how can progressives respond is like, well, you've left the group. You might say, well, I'm going to have some more expansive group of all progressives plus former progressives, or redefine it so it can lose almost all of its most famous characteristics while still remaining a thing. And it's like, all right, if you're that desperate to go and save the tribe called progressive, go ahead. But I mean, in terms of like winning, again, I think the reasonable thing is, probably they should just resist and double down and hope for a recession around the time of the next election. That's their best bet.
I think that to some extent, progressives have already, like you said, it's a little bit of a I don't want to say a dead letter, but with the Trump administration coming in, I've seen that pulling back on pronouns and bios, right? I think Alexandria,
pulling back on what?
Pronouns in your bio.
Okay, yeah.
Right. I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez took hers out. Everyone's just quietly removing, these things because they realized that they pushed it too far. It was something too visceral about the human experience and too obviously real, sex, biological sex, that they pushed people over the edge. But I agree with Bryan that what they may pull back on some of those markers that were causing a reaction, But I imagine they'll generally double down. I mean, that won't change them in a fundamental way.
Yeah. Or like the standard strategy is you run as a moderate and then govern as an ideologue. Right. It's generally effective. And again, sort of this whole idea that this election was a total repudiation. All right. It's like 47 to 53. It's not a total repudiation of anything.
No,
It's
exactly.
like it is this natural human tendency to take a marginal difference that feeds into a binary outcome and then act like it's night and day, and it's just not. I mean, I think like if I were on their side, I would say, well, look, we had this senile guy, and then we didn't have the guts to go and toss him overboard when we should have, and then we had a last minute switch which didn't work out very well, and like we should have planned a bit better, but so that's pretty much how we should have handled it, and done a little bit better PR, and then we can win. We don't need to admit anything's wrong, and we're not wrong, by the way. But
well, Bryan,
so you guys don't believe in the vibe shift that Tyler Cowen
yeah, like Tyler is just so. I mean, I'm not even going to say he's dogmatic on it. He self-described before we had the word troll. He self-described as mischievous. I think he knows better, but he enjoys antagonizing people by pretending like a 47 to 53% difference is night and day. And he'll have some story about it. Well, it did lead to a big difference in outcome, but it's like, okay, but that does not show that there was some large shift in actual public opinion. Not even close. It's a marginal one. And I think also like if there was one real lesson that I think that Democrats should have gotten from it is don't get high inflation. Listen to Larry Summers. Larry Summers told you that if you did it, you get high inflation. You did, and people were really upset about it. And we have a pile of evidence from the 70s and 80s that voters have a very strong negative reaction to high inflation, even when they personally gain. I remember my parents actually were basically given a free house by the high inflation of the 70s and 80s. They really were. They had a fixed rate mortgage, 1972, and that inflation wiped out most of the real value of the mortgage. But do you think my parents ever said, woo, inflation, yeah, I gave us a free house? No, they were mad about the milk was expensive.
Yeah.
Like I was just a kid. I didn't understand what was going on, but I look back and say, wait a second. Like the milk was a rounding error. We were the beneficiaries of this total profligacy and orgy of printing money. So that would be another thing that I would focus on. And this other stuff, it's like, if only we would just kept the inflation in line, we could have done all the other stuff we want to do. Damn it.
Let me ask a smaller question then, not about the body politic. Do you think that the vibe will change around George Mason? Because I think you thought it was getting pretty woke, let's say a year and a half ago. So do you think that vibe is going to change?
Yeah. So if we had some good measure of what people actually think, then a little bit. I mean, the important thing to understand is that when at its wokest, people weren't really as woke as you would assume, because the people who disagreed were keeping their heads down and shutting up and trying to avoid getting picked on.
But that's a vibe shift, right?
Yes.
If people
shut it,
if you can talk about the emperor having no clothes, that's a shift.
Yeah, I would say, look, if vibes means anything, it's what people actually think and think and feel, and then there's what's observed, which is an imperfect proxy for that. But I say what's really happened at Mason is that we, again, by a fairly narrow margin, elected a Republican governor. And the way that the governing board of George Mason works is that the governor gets to appoint 4 people per year for a board of 16 people. What this means is that once he finally was in for 3 years, then 12 out of 16 were his appointees, and they were very different from the others. But again, that's another case where you get a night and day difference from a continuous variable being a little bit above or below a threshold. It did actually make a difference because the new people were really against at least fairly against DEI, and definitely they didn't want to have any further extensions. That's why I was involved in this Just Societies controversy. Probably the main thing that mattered was that because I knew that the board was no longer sympathetic, I thought it was worthwhile to go and publicize some criticism, and then that got to their attention, and then possibly, I'll say there's some moderate chance, like 10 or 15%, that I, just by going and tweeting, was able to tip the scales against making all new GMU students do 2 mandatory brainwashing courses. But yeah, that itself, it is like so tempting to think that because there is a change in administration, there must have been a big change. You know, if there's a big change in what the administration is doing, there must be a big change in what people think. But yeah, it's a binary system. So either one party's in charge or the other. And if you just tip the scales a little bit, it really does matter. You know, economists call this regression discontinuity. And yeah.
I want
Rachel,
to
do you see
argue a little
anything
bit.
going on in academia that looks different? Rachel,
I'm sorry, Arnold, I didn't hear you.
do you
What did
see
you say?
anything going on in academia that looks different than a year ago? Do you think? Do you see a change in the vibe, as it were?
Can I just push back on Brian's earlier point and then I'll answer your
Okay.
question? I
Sure.
didn't want to lose my train of thought. I do want to make an argument that you might find interesting, Brian, which is this. I understand your point about just slight differences that seem, that appear to be more significant than they are. But what about something like the shift in racial voting demographics? And here's what I mean by that. When you have a population, what do political scientists call it? Linked fate, right? Linked fate. So if Black people, for instance, think if we're not going to have a voice at all unless we vote all together, and so you have a population that's voting, 90% one way or something like that, to have a 4 or an 8% or a 10% shift, even among just men, right, or something like that, is huge. For that population, that's sort of an earthquake within that particular culture to have that much of a shift. And then, of course, Latinos, we've been seeing them shift, and they're getting close to almost being 50-50. Native Americans, oh my gosh, 65% Republican. And okay, so say it again.
That's true.
That's the graph I saw. I'll find it and send it to you so you can tell me whether that's true.
Hard to believe.
Yeah, it's wild, right? And so, so the question of whether or not that there's Trump has some mandate or something, I don't think that at all. But has there been a shift in alignment, in political alignment, where that feeling of linked fate is shifting away actually from identity politics? And people are arguing maybe it's going more towards class. I don't know that class has ever been an identity in American culture the way it is in other cultures. Or if it's just, other factors, other cultural factors. But it's interesting to me to see that kind of breakaway that's been occurring in just this and the last election. And so it may, even though it's a small amount from a certain perspective, historically, it's a very large amount. And so it's it almost, to me, shows a level of confidence. Like maybe we don't need to vote together. Maybe we can just pursue our own personal interests, and I don't have to think of myself as voting as a member of this identity group.
Yeah, so anytime that you see a moderate change in the general population, you're going to find that in some subgroups there are much larger changes. So yeah, you're right. So the big one I would say is Hispanic shifting Republican. The other ones are much more moderate. In terms of the big shift in academia, this is one where we've got data going back 10 years. So it was 10 years ago, there was barely any difference in how supportive Democrats and Republicans were of higher education. And both groups were quite optimistic.
Right.
And what happened starting in 2015 is pretty much for the first time in US history, Republicans discovered that most university professors didn't like them. And the reaction was like, what, they don't like us? What, us? Lovable us? Like, why? Like, they're leftists. What they are? And it took, so, I mean, you might say, like, how could you be so oblivious as not know that? But they were oblivious to that. And then finally, around 2015, we saw that Republican optimism about higher education really did crash. And again, it started off, there's like a 5 or 10 percentage point gap. It was like 65% of Democrats had a very favorable view and 55% Republicans. Democrats went down like 5 or 10 percentage points, and Republicans went down about 30 percentage points. So now it is very widely understood among Republicans that especially humanities and social science professors think they're terrible. which, of course, being on a campus, it's like, you didn't know this? Like, it's totally standard to have multiple gratuitous jokes about Republicans in every political science class. But they didn't know.
Well, bringing that back to this book a little bit, it could be that the one reason that progressives wouldn't gain much by reading this book is that, assuming that there's some version of progressivism that is worth retaining, which, even the most anti-woke people in the Democratic Party would assert that. It might not be the things that Bryan would want them to hold on to, because it would be a lot of their sort of anti-market views. But he hasn't debunked anti-marketism. That's a different job. But the main thing that a progressive made
He does have a chapter on regulation, which, of course,
the regulation chapter.
It's trying to rush through a huge topic that deserves a book of its own. But
right. But the main thing that they need to learn is to sort of be less contemptuous of everybody else. I mean, I think that, I think some of the shifts that we're talking about were people realizing that they're being held in contempt by the progressives. And, well, if you have contempt for me, well, why should I in any way be supportive of you? I think that's kind of the most important cultural shift is a combination of people expressing contempt and people realizing that they're held in contempt.
As to how much of the Hispanic shift is just caused by a single letter of moving from O to X.
Yeah.
Latinx.
Like Latinx. I don't think we're ever going to know, but like the idea that like that letter could have cost them like 5 percentage points of the Hispanic vote, just like not crazy. It's like it's like you, and it's like, no, we respect you too much to go and speak normal Spanish.
Yeah, but also how much can you do that as a progressive when the central idea of your worldview is that regular people need to be ruled by experts, and particularly experts that are focused on a scientific or materialist view of the world. I would say, Bryan, one of the major reasons for the Latino shift is religious. Latino people are some of the most religious, whether they're Catholic or Pentecostal or whatever it is. They're some of the most religious people in the United States. And to have the sort of LGBTQ drumbeat going as far left as it did, it was just offensive to people who have a view of human persons that is spiritual and moral as well as material. And so part of me thinks, just saying, well, I should just look down on people less, or I should have less contempt. But in a way, the progressive worldview is contemptuous. That's what it's saying. Regular people making free choices will screw up their lives, and they need to be ruled by us. We're the experts. So I don't know that they can reel themselves back out of that.
I think a lot of the worldview is that there's some horrible people like Charles Koch spreading lies and misinformation, which then goes and deludes the innocent, stalwart masses who naturally would be on our side. Yes. So, that's like a very standard leftist view. I mean, almost surely there'd be a lot of objection. Like we don't even rule by experts. And like in particular, like we're trying to go and dethrone the traditional experts in favor of these voice of the people who coincidentally are people who look different but think the same.
So you're really showing your age, Bryan. Charles Koch, that's like so last year. You're an oligarchy. It's Elon Musk who's the current devil and string puller and whatever puppeteer.
Yeah, so Musk is bigger, but still, even when during the Trump presidency, the amount of hate that we spewed on Charles Koch, and it's like, why him, man?
All right, so Shelley, I'll give the audience one more chance, or else
we have a small queue. We've got 3 people already.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, great. Steve, if you can unmute yourself, you are free to talk.
Yeah, all right. Thanks for doing this. Had a question. about the target audience for this book, and sort of under the guise of, does he do a good job steel manning? And I know it's not the aim of it, but does it pass the ideological Turing test? Just kind of wondering about who we'll have salience with and who I maybe can pass it along to change some minds.
Yeah, I think for a book that moves at the clip that this book does, he does a very good job of moving very quickly through the arguments. I think he does do a good job of bringing up all of the main objections that a progressive would raise to what he's saying and trying to reply to them.
I mean, I would say that he's not exactly steel manning. What he's doing is saying this is an extremely common view, very widely held, and and then he go and produce a lot of quotations from people who are not marginal figures, from people who are well known and high status within the progressive movement, and say, look, you can say that there's some leftists who don't think this, but it's a very common view, and I'm just responding to them. So rather than steel manning, it's just like real manning. It's one where you are just trying to address the actual common view. If you're to describe the intended audience, in a way, it is just the rationalist community, which does tend to lean left, but is very responsive to this way of thinking, this way of presenting evidence. So you might think that in a way, the primary goal is to remove progressive elements from repressive ideas from the rationalist movement, also thinking these are the people that are most likely to actually be swayed and say, well, my primary identity is as a rationalist. It's not any particular political conclusions. Those are disposable, but what's not disposable is being a reasonable person. Of course, he's not trying to limit it to that, but when you're reading it, I think you would say, yeah, this is sort of aimed at people that would like Scott Alexander, for example.
Good point. Thanks.
Sure.
Thank you, Steve. John, if you would like to unmute yourself.
Hey, John. It's John Alcorn.
Here I am. Good to see you. Thanks for a lively, fascinating discussion. I'd like to ask the panelists to steelman what they have called conservative myths. Consider two examples. Bear with me a moment. One that was mentioned was vaccines. The term covers various technologies, from low-dose infection with the live pathogen, all the way up to new technology, mRNA. And one may distinguish effects on contagion from effects on the severity of the illness conditional on infection. And one may consider whether a vaccine requirement might backfire by inducing opposition. Well, you see, and you can think through many more. So, are these conservative myths? I mean, for example, Bryan had an entrepreneurial venture with a T-shirt in year one of the pandemic, "Fear me not," about getting the vaccine because he had taken the vaccine, and then maybe it turned out that was mistargeted because that particular technology didn't greatly reduce contagion or transmission. I'm not an expert, but you see what I mean. And second, let me just give you one more example that was brought up: conspiracy theories. Some are true.
Right. That's right.
Many or most not the lizard man one perhaps, but most conspiracy theories partly have, in a dynamic sense, have some sort of positive epistemic value insofar as they motivate people, proponents and opponents alike, to dig deeper and possibly get closer to truth. The truth is a process also. So whatever it is in the end, examples of this sort of dynamic, epistemic dynamic, might be the JFK assassination and the origins of the COVID virus. So, I guess my intuition is a book about putative conservative myths. It would have to be very, very different, not just in particular topics, than the book about progressive myths, because the progressive myths have a clear scope. The conservative myths, there's this nuance or parsing that's more part of getting at them. Thoughts?
I guess I would start by saying that I think that the nuanced versions are held only by a very small number of people among conservatives.
That's what I was gonna say.
Actually, so I mean that's just to start on, like, your general point about vaccines and there's some complications. Yes, of course, I will stand by my T-shirt because what was well established is that initially it had a very strong effect on contagion, but that just wore off. So like what it was shorter run, but it was not wrong. Like that was very well backed up. I actually managed to have millions of views of a tweet that I did about how my doctor was heavily pressuring me to get a tetanus shot, and I looked it up, and only 2 Americans die of tetanus per year. And then people flipped out at me for saying that I didn't want to get it, and saying like you're an anti-vaxxer, and I'm like, look, the risk was the gain was so low. And then there were a bunch of really crummy arguments about contagion, like, no, tetanus is not a contagious disease, nothing to do with contagion. And then it's like, oh, well, there's only cases because almost everyone's vaccinated. And then I look, no, actually, it's not true. There's only like 2/3 vaccination. So if nobody had it, then there'd probably be like 6 deaths per year. It is not actually an important issue. So yes, those are fine. However, we actually are seeing a notable decline in standard classic vaccinations against measles, things like that among kids. And I think that is driven by this. The point on, do vaccine mandates actually cause skepticism? Yeah, maybe. It's a good, interesting point.
Yeah.
And let's see. And then on the one on conspiracy theories, yeah, that one I'm not going to say. I think in general they have value because there's finite time. And so just saying let's be open to everything is not a good idea. Like, it's very important to be closed to almost everything, because if you weren't, you would not have a reasonable amount of time for things that are actually worth paying attention to. So like, are there certain very specific things that initially get labeled conspiracy theories that turn out to be reasonable afterwards? Yeah. I think those are also one, there's a lot of them. I would just say there's an initial level of like, that's really implausible, like Pizzagate, that kind of thing. Ones where you need to have a code of silence among a large number of people, where knowing how inclined people are to blab. And it's like,
Yeah.
how can you keep a secret like that? So I'm not too convinced that, or I think it's very unlikely that there's much value in just being really open-minded about conspiracies. It's one where I think it would really be better if we had a system where you could, you can put some money in to go and say this one deserves to be taken seriously. On the origins of COVID, you might have seen on Scott Alexander's blog, there actually was a guy who like, they just put up a lot of money on, and then they to have a debate on it, they picked a panel of experts that both agreed would be reasonable, and then the guy who was against the lab leak theory totally won.
Hey, did you want to add anything, Rachel?
No, Bryan made my point. I think that I'm not actually concerned with the steel man, right? Which might make fine distinctions between this type of vaccine or that. I'm concerned with the way it's snowballing and becoming just a general anti-vax position, which is, not among those who are very nuanced with it. So I agree with that. And I also think that our prejudice should be against conspiracy theories, even though I'm quite aware of a few that are actually real. That's absolutely true. But massive cooperation that requires secrecy among many, many people is actually very, very hard to do. It's extremely unlikely. And even the conspiracies we know of are a smaller, whether it's medical experiments, by the army, or, various things that have occurred in our history. It's a smaller group of people than a lot of the conspiracy theories you hear about, people who would have had to have kept it a secret. And so I think it totally overestimates the possibility of this, this Illuminati, right? Like this group of people who are so good at cooperating with one another. I seriously doubt that. It's not reasonable to me.
I do remember some hilarious exposés of the Kochs where there was a public meeting where people who were associated with the Kochs were talking about stuff, and then a left-wing group just sent a journalist to attend, and they signed up like a normal person, talked to people, and then wrote a big blowing the lid on this conspiracy. It's a public conference, anyone can go. the fact that you consider this a revelation is really mostly a testament to just how socially isolated you are and how you are odd for a journalist. But
Thank you.
I guess my view on this is that, we're at an odd point in terms of social learning in that we don't have a trusted consensus of who to believe.
Mhm.
And the progressives have kind of, fallen off their pedestal
Right.
in that regard. And that, so we don't have the Walter Cronkite or even the New York Times, they become believed by their partisans, but not by the vast bulk of people. And anyway, that's a whole.
I mean, I think but mostly it's a positive. They didn't deserve to be on a pedestal before.
Yeah.
That might be
But
true,
but
but
I
it did
guess
allow us to-
but going a little bit back to to John Alcorn's statements that there may be worse things than having Walter Cronkite on a pedestal, and that's sort of to have a kind of a epistemic nihilism, sort of people just not believing anything or believing anything, and that I don't think we should be 100% thrilled that there's no that um, that the majority of people no longer will trust, the New York Times, or they just, everyone just goes to their corner and says, well, I'll trust the people in my corner and I won't trust the people in the other corner. Did we have another question though, Shelley?
We do. In fact, we have two. Glenn, if you would like to unmute, please.
It's all trying to make my question very brief. So if I think back to, back when I was a kid, which is a long time ago, there were a lot of progressive beliefs that were not probably well accepted in their time, but decades later are very mainstream. Civil rights is the most obvious example. Is it possible that some of these things that we are thinking of as myths and distasteful progressive beliefs will one day become mainstream? And if so, which of those do you think might be?
Well, I'll just say I would hope that the things that are, because humor picks out some very specific beliefs that can be falsified, you would hope that those don't become true. Now, whether the broader progressive agenda sort of, is viewed 20 years from now as, that was great, we all accepted it. Because you're right that, now even people who, people whose conservatives whose ancestors, so to speak, hated Martin Luther King in the 1960s now will cite him. And so there's, but whether people who now dislike critical race theory will, their descendants 20 years from now will say, oh, that was spot on. I guess I hope that's not going to happen.
Yeah,
I
I mean,
also-
overall, I'm pessimistic. I mean, we've got two basic facts. First of all, the young are way woker than the rest of the population, and two is people very rarely change the political views that they form when they're young. So just based upon demographic shifts, I think the anti-woke people are going to die off and get replaced with a new generation that takes the stuff, if not as gospel, then at least as conventional wisdom. They won't be as fanatical as the advocates, but they also aren't going to see the advocates as being liars or just making stuff up. So yeah, I share Arnold's hopes, but hopes and predictions are totally different things. So, right now, so I think it's like there's this idea of, well, you're on the wrong side of history. It's like, is there a long run tendency for true views to win on controversial issues of philosophy and politics? There's a lot of evidence in the long run, things like science wins, but it's got to be on boring stuff that hardly anybody cares about. If it's part of somebody's secular religion, then I don't think there's any sign that truth wins out. I mean, if you look, is there any sign that the true religion is winning? Right? It's like, even if it's the number one religion of Christianity, still they've got like a third market share after 2,000 years. So it's like, if your process of truth winning out takes millennia, yeah, it's not much of a process, is it?
I do think there's an impatience starting to rise in the Black community over what they are thinking of as kind of an abuse of civil rights where everyone wants to piggyback on the moral credibility of the civil rights movement. And I think Black Americans there's a certain cadre of Black Americans who are saying, no, that's our thing. It had its own moral case. And you don't just get to say, well, we did this. And so now every new cause is the new civil rights.
Yeah, well, that's the point of the word BIPOC, right? That's the whole point of the word BIPOC, is to say, all right, yes, so there's a lot of oppressed people, but Black's the most important, Indigenous then, and then the last one is like everybody else gets thrown into, but to know your place in the hierarchy. I mean, even the acronym LGBT, it's like, wait, the L's are number one. And I think, okay, so the L's get to be number one. And then actually there is a group that got to beat the L's. So if you were reading Justin Trudeau, the 2S got to beat the L's, and the 2S got moved to the front. And like, who are the 2S? The two spirit people. It's like, they're beating L's. Wow. Like, that is some serious mojo that you can go and dethrone the L's from the number one position after all these years. Like, my hat's off to you for being able to pull that off.
Well, thank you.
Should we take Kevin's question?
Yes, Kevin, please go ahead.
Yes, I'll try to make this quick. So when the discussion got to the point about how it might be an issue of contempt that's driven the apparent shift in the vibes, that triggered a memory of a blog post that Bryan Caplan wrote many years ago about the phenomenon of certain communities that reliably vote Democrat, I believe like Asian Americans, Jewish Americans, Mexican Americans, who as communities tend to be overwhelmingly more conservative in their own values and views and their levels of religiosity and the like, still tend to vote Democrat very often. And Bryan's theory about it in that post was simply because that they felt like the Democratic Party was the party that treated them with more respect. Mm-hmm. And that was ultimately who they were aligning with. And I wonder now, to what degree is this apparent vibe shift because they're feeling like they're losing that level of respect, particularly with the whole DEI, and there's this oppression Olympics where certain communities are privileged compared to others, and particularly how that has impacted Asian American and Jewish American communities in particular. Like they're too successful, so there's been kind of this, we need to kind of tamp down a little bit on how much we're supporting those communities and elevating others above them. And then of course with the Latino community, the Latinx, I have no idea how you're even supposed to pronounce that.
Latinx.
Yeah, exactly. It's just this idea that, their language has a gender binary built into it, which is wrong. That is the ultimate boogeyman of the moment. So we need to fix your language for you. Mm-hmm. That they're feeling like now it's the Democrats who are showing them they've lost the respect of the Democrats, and that's what's making them turn over to the other side. Do you think there might be an element of that going on?
Yeah, I'd like to claim total vindication, but I just remember a bunch of things that Trump said that were negative about Hispanics. And if Hispanics had switched overwhelmingly over to Democrats, I would have said the theory was confirmed. So if your theory predicts both that and the opposite, then I'm not going to say that it actually is, at least that particular kind of evidence doesn't count as great evidence. I mean, I still think the theory in general makes a lot of sense. Like, why is it the lawyers are so Democratic, even though they're rich? And like, well, everybody tells lawyer jokes, but the Republicans tell them more.
It's an interesting thought. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what I think about it. I guess I would say that I think that the Democrats just went too far. Pushing beyond what people were culturally comfortable with. Mm-hmm. And so it's not that the Republicans did an amazing job of reaching out to these groups, but they did a little bit. And like I said, there's that weird shift going on in terms of the linked fate phenomenon, where that's starting to break up a little bit in these groups. And so, you are starting to see, I mean, let's give an example, right? The YMCA, right? I mean, this is silly, but Donald Trump dancing to the YMCA with the Village People. Gay icons, and this is what's happening at the Republican National Convention, along with like Snoop Dogg, DJing, and so there's definitely a shift happening there that we need to pay attention to. I don't know exactly how we want to explain it. It could be because Trump pardoned some people that meant a lot to Snoop Dogg, But you know, it is a fascinating time to be alive. I can say that much.
I mean, that's say if the Democrats kept inflation at 2% and Biden had stepped down and allowed a normal primary, I think there's at least a 40% chance they would have won.
Yeah, good point.
Thank you, Kevin. Arnold, do you have any closing words?
Well, it's been an interesting discussion and I hope people get a sense that this is an interesting book and that it is readable. It's not philosophy speak, even though a philosopher is speaking. I think if Bryan is right about the demographic trends favoring young people being progressive, then we shouldn't just let this election say that progressive myths are buried and gone. So with that, thanks very much. It was a great discussion.
Yep. And so my endorsement, so the best book on wokeness, the best book on the topic. I've read a bunch. It's the best.
It's very good. I also highly recommend it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all. Thank you, Arnold, Bryan, and Rachel for joining us today. We will be announcing our next From the Shelf coming up in our February EconLib newsletter that comes out the first Monday of every month. So we hope to see you again, and everybody enjoy the rest of your week. Thank you so much.
Adios.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good one.